Most men enter retirement believing they've finally earned their reward. They're wrong. What awaits isn't paradise, it's a minefield of potential regrets that can poison your final decades. The mistakes of those in their 80s and 90s aren't just sad stories, they're warnings. Ignore them at your peril. These retirement regrets reveal psychological truths about meaning that most men discover too late. You still have time to avoid their fate, but that window is closing. It's on you to listen and act now. You know that sensation in your joints when you first rise in the morning, that stiffness that wasn't there a decade ago. Most men mistake it for the inevitable march of age, but that's not quite right. What you're feeling isn't just time passing, it's the accumulation of thousands of neglected days. Days when you said, "I'll start exercising tomorrow." Days when you ignored what your body was telling you. I've spoken with countless men in their 80s and 90s, and their most visceral regret isn't about money or missed vacations. It's about the body they abandoned while chasing everything else. They didn't realize that physical vitality is the foundation upon which everything else stands. Consider this: your physical health isn't just about longevity, it's about freedom. The ability to play with grandchildren without pain, to travel without requiring assistance, to maintain your dignity through self-sufficiency. When you neglect preventative care, you're not just risking disease, you're surrendering your autonomy prematurely. Look at the psychological dimension here. Jung talked about the shadow, those rejected aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. For many men, the aging body becomes the ultimate shadow. They'd rather pretend it isn't happening than confront the responsibility of maintenance. But running from your physicality is like ignoring the foundation of a house while renovating the kitchen. Everything else will eventually collapse. The most revealing pattern I've witnessed is this: men who maintain their physical strength maintain their psychological resilience. It's not merely correlation. The relationship between physical capability and mental fortitude is profound. When your body remains capable, your mind resists the creeping victim mentality that poisons late life. Now let's talk about what happens when you postpone physical activity until you have more time. Retirement doesn't magically create the motivation you lacked during your working years. In fact, without the structure of work, many men become even more sedentary. The retirees with the fewest regrets established fitness habits decades before retirement. They didn't wait for the perfect time because they understood there isn't one. The core psychological principle at work here is identity continuity. Your body's capabilities are fundamental to how you perceive yourself. When those capabilities diminish rapidly, your identity fractures. You become a stranger to yourself. This is why maintaining physical fitness isn't vanity. It's preserving your fundamental sense of self. Then there's the matter of unhealthy habits that senior men maintain despite repeated warnings. The smoker who ignored his persistent cough, the drinker who dismissed his swelling liver, the sedentary man who rationalized his shortness of breath. By the time they reached their 80s, these men weren't just living with regret, they were living with the concrete consequences of willful blindness. What makes this particularly tragic is that it represents a failure not of knowledge but of wisdom. These men knew the risks intellectually. What they lacked was the capacity to translate that knowledge into consistent action, to see beyond immediate comfort to long-term consequences. The rule is brutally simple: your body keeps the score. It records every choice, every indulgence, every postponement, and eventually it presents the bill. The oldest men I've interviewed who maintained their vitality into their 90s weren't genetic outliers. They were simply men who paid the maintenance costs consistently rather than the catastrophic repair costs later. You don't need to become an athlete at 65, but you do need to become responsible. Your remaining decades depend not on luck, but on a daily reckoning with reality. The men who faced this truth without flinching lived not just longer, but incomparably better. Relationship failures. They call them the golden years for a reason. But gold doesn't appear without refinement, and relationships in retirement are no different. I've sat with men in their final years, tears streaming down weathered faces, not because of failed investments or missed career opportunities, but because they stand alone, surrounded by people they should know intimately, yet separated by decades of emotional neglect. Let me tell you something profound about human nature. We are fundamentally social creatures. This isn't just some feel-good psychology. It's hardwired into our neurological structure. Isolation literally kills. Studies show loneliness is as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes daily. Yet men consistently underinvest in what matters most: the relationships that sustain them when everything else falls away. Not investing time in strengthening family bonds is perhaps the most common regret I hear. One man told me, "I was always going to reconnect with my son next month." Next month became next year. Next year became never. By the time he realized what he'd done, his son had stopped trying. The tragedy isn't just the lost relationship. It's that he deceived himself about having time. Time isn't infinite, especially with those who matter. The psychological principle at work here is deceptively simple. We confuse physical presence with emotional connection. Being in the same house for 40 years doesn't create intimacy. Intimacy requires vulnerability, attention, and the courage to say what needs saying. Most men avoid vulnerability like it's weakness, not realizing it's the foundation of everything meaningful. Now consider what happens when friendships fade after leaving work. Your social circle shrinks dramatically after retirement. Without the structure of daily workplace interaction, maintaining connections requires intentional effort. The men with the fewest regrets understood this transition and built friendship practices that outlasted their careers. They scheduled regular meetings, initiated gatherings, and refused to let convenience dictate their social lives. There's a Jungian dimension to this. The persona you cultivated at work isn't necessarily the full expression of who you are. Retirement offers the opportunity to develop parts of yourself previously neglected, but this can only happen in relationship with others. In isolation, you become a caricature of yourself, rehearsing the same thoughts without growth. The deepest regret often comes from failing to resolve long-standing conflicts. Pride becomes a prison. I've interviewed men who carried grudges for decades, against brothers, children, former friends. By the time they realized the absurdity of their position, key relationships had atrophied beyond repair. What they wouldn't give for the chance to say, "I was wrong" or "I forgive you" to someone no longer living. This connects to our fundamental need for narrative resolution. Unresolved conflicts create psychological dissonance that disturbs our peace. The mind keeps returning to these open loops, preventing us from fully inhabiting the present. The cost isn't just relational, it's a tax on your mental health paid daily. Perhaps most painful is the regret of failing to express love and appreciation. Men in particular tend to assume their feelings are obvious. "She knows I love her. I've stayed for 50 years. But people need words. They need to hear what they mean to you, specifically and frequently. The withholding of emotional expression isn't strength. It's fear disguised as stoicism. The psychological truth here cuts deep. Unexpressed appreciation diminishes your capacity to experience gratitude. When you habitually swallow expressions of love, you eventually stop noticing opportunities to give it. The men who faced death with the fewest regrets were those who made explicit what they valued in others, who refused to let important words remain unsaid. Make no mistake, relationships aren't just nice additions to a good life. They are the life. When the career accolades fade and physical capabilities diminish, what remains is who you loved and who loved you. The quality of those connections becomes the measure of your life, not your bank account, not your achievements, your capacity for genuine human. Financial and practical missteps. Money isn't everything, but retirement without financial security becomes a psychological torture chamber. I've counseled elderly men who wake each morning to the gnawing anxiety of insufficient resources. Their regret isn't about missing luxury. It's about the loss of basic dignity and choice, the freedom to make decisions without fear. The pattern is disturbingly consistent. Most men plan for retirement as if it's a vacation, not a quarter of their adult lives. They consider only basic necessities, ignoring how expenses evolve with age. Medical costs increase. Inflation erodes purchasing power. The ability to generate new income diminishes. What appears adequate at 65 becomes woefully insufficient by 85. This reveals a fundamental psychological blind spot, our inability to properly envision our future selves. Research shows we literally treat our future selves as strangers. We're willing to impose hardships on that stranger that we would never accept for ourselves today. It's a failure of psychological continuity, not just financial planning. Consider the men who failed to downsize their living arrangements until forced by circumstance. They clung to oversized homes out of sentimentality or status, then faced hasty, undignified exits when health or finances collapsed. The most satisfied elderly men I've interviewed made proactive housing decisions while they still had agency. They chose environments that supported their changing needs before crisis dictated their options. This connects to our need for territorial control. Your living space isn't just shelter, it's an extension of your identity and autonomy. Making deliberate choices about where and how you live preserves psychological well-being. Being forced to move under duress creates profound disorientation beyond mere inconvenience. Perhaps most painful are the regrets around postponing meaningful experiences. We'll travel when I retire. We'll reconnect with family later. But age brings physical limitations. Energy diminishes. Health complications arise. The window for certain experiences closes permanently. The men with fewest regrets understood that some opportunities have expiration dates. This touches on a deeper philosophical truth. Life isn't experienced in aggregate. It's lived in specific moments of engagement or disengagement. Postponing meaningful experiences isn't just delaying gratification. It's often forfeiting it entirely. The quality of your retirement isn't determined by its length, but by its depth. Then there's the practical matter of legal documents and end-of-life plans. The absence of clear directives creates devastating burdens for families. I've seen brothers stop speaking after disagreements about a parent's care. I've watched widows drained financially by preventable administrative nightmares. The most responsible men recognize that end-of-life planning isn't morbid. It's an act of love toward those you'll leave behind. The psychological resistance here is profound. Creating a will or advance directive means confronting mortality. It triggers our deepest existential fears. But avoidance doesn't grant immortality. It simply transfers the pain to loved ones. The men who faced these tasks head-on described an unexpected benefit, a clarifying effect on how they chose to live their remaining years. The underlying principle is stark. Control what you can while you can. Financial and practical matters might seem mundane compared to relationships or purpose, but they create the foundation that enables everything else. Without basic security, higher needs become luxury items rather than necessities. What separates men who thrive in late life from those crushed by regret isn't luck or wealth, it's foresight and courage. The willingness to make difficult decisions before they're forced upon you. The discipline to consider consequences beyond immediate comfort. The wisdom to recognize that practical matters aren't separate from emotional or spiritual well-being. They're prerequisites for it. The day after retirement often reveals a terrifying truth: many men have no idea who they are without their job titles. I've watched accomplished professionals crumble into depression, not because they miss the work, but because they've lost their place in the world. Their identity, constructed entirely around career achievement, shatters when the business card becomes irrelevant. This represents a profound psychological error. Carl Jung warned about over-identification with the persona, the social mask we wear. When your self-worth depends entirely on external validation and professional status, retirement becomes an identity crisis, not just a career transition. The men who suffer most are those who answered "What do you do?" with only their occupation for decades. Consider what happens psychologically when your primary source of meaning suddenly vanishes. The brain craves coherence, a story that makes sense of your existence. Without that narrative structure, existential anxiety floods in. Who am I now? What purpose do I serve? These aren't abstract philosophical questions, they're daily torments for men who define themselves solely through work. The most content elderly men diversified their identity investments long before retirement. They cultivated interests outside work that provided continuity through the transition. They were fathers, craftsmen, community members, students of history, not just accountants or executives. Their sense of self transcended professional accomplishment. This connects to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Once basic security is established, humans require belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. Work often provides all three. Remove it without replacement, and psychological deterioration follows swiftly. The regret isn't about missing the job, it's about the emptiness that follows when nothing fills that fundamental human need for purpose. Now consider those who avoid new challenges out of fear or pride. Age becomes their excuse for intellectual stagnation. I'm too old to learn technology. That's for younger people. But the research is unequivocal. Cognitive function diminishes primarily through disuse, not age alone. The brain remains plastic well into your 90s. The men with the sharpest minds in late life were those who continuously challenged their assumptions and abilities. This resistance reveals a deeper psychological vulnerability, fear of incompetence. After decades of mastery in your field, beginning again as a novice threatens your self-concept. It requires humility to say, "I don't know how this works. Will you teach me?" But that humility preserves cognitive function and connects you to younger generations. Pride might feel comfortable, but it accelerates obsolescence. Perhaps most tragic is surrendering to technological alienation. I've interviewed men who became functional hermits because they refused to engage with changing communication methods. They blamed kids these days for not using landlines, while their peers built vibrant connections through new platforms. This isn't about becoming a technology enthusiast. It's about maintaining your place in the human conversation. The psychological principle here is adaptability versus rigidity. Erik Erikson identified a key late-life crisis: integrity versus despair. Those who adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core values achieve integrity. Those who calcify against change fall into despair. Technology itself isn't the issue. It's what it represents. Your willingness to remain engaged with a changing world. The underlying pattern in all these regrets is mistaking stability for stagnation. Life remains dynamic until its end. The men who thrived embraced continuous becoming rather than static being. They understood that identity isn't something you achieve once. It's something you actively construct throughout life. When you stop constructing, you start diminishing. This points to a fundamental truth about human development. It has no upper age limit. The capacity for growth, for new insight, for meaningful contribution doesn't diminish with age unless you choose abandonment. The men I've interviewed with the least regret were those who remained apprentices to life itself, continuously discovering new aspects of themselves in the world around them. Spiritual and existential regrets. Death has a remarkable way of clarifying what matters. In those final conversations with men in their 9th decade, I've never once heard someone express regret about a missed promotion or an unacquired possession. Instead, their eyes fill with a different kind of grief, the recognition of spiritual opportunities forever lost. The deeper questions they postponed until it was too late. Not confronting mortality until forced by circumstance represents perhaps the most profound psychological error. By avoiding the reality of your finite existence, you create an illusion of limitless time. This isn't optimism, it's delusion, and it leads to catastrophic life mismanagement. The men with the richest final years were those who acknowledged their mortality decades earlier, not morbidly, but honestly. This awareness didn't diminish their lives. It infused each day with heightened significance. This connects directly to what existential philosophers call authenticity. Living authentically requires facing the truth of your situation, including its temporal limits. When you deny death's reality, you deny life's preciousness. The psychological mechanism is straightforward. Acknowledging limits creates value. What's infinitely available generates little appreciation. What's recognized as finite becomes sacred. Consider those who failed to discover or pursue deeper meaning. Our culture emphasizes accumulation and achievement while remaining silent about purpose. But the psychological research is unequivocal. Meaning-centered lives show greater resilience against depression, cognitive decline, and existential anxiety. The most tormented elderly men I've counseled weren't those who faced physical suffering. They were those who couldn't answer why their lives mattered at all. This illustrates Viktor Frankl's core insight. Humans require meaning more fundamentally than pleasure or power. Without a why to your existence, suffering becomes unbearable. With meaning, almost any how can be endured. The men who faced death with equanimity weren't necessarily religious in conventional terms, but they all possessed a framework that made sense of their lives within something larger than themselves. Perhaps the most poignant regret involves failing to pass on wisdom and legacy. I've watched men realize too late that they never shared what genuinely mattered. Their hard-earned insights, their values, the lessons beneath their accomplishments. Their knowledge died with them, leaving children and grandchildren to repeat avoidable mistakes. The psychological tragedy isn't just personal loss, it's the breaking of intergenerational wisdom transmission. This relates to Erikson's concept of generativity versus stagnation. Humans need to create continuing significance beyond their biological lifespan. The men who achieved this weren't necessarily famous or wealthy. They were those who consciously shaped the values and understanding of younger generations. They recognized that immortality exists not through denial of death, but through what endures after you're gone. Then there's the pattern of postponing spiritual exploration until crisis points. Many men approach religion or philosophical inquiry only when confronted with loss, illness, or their own mortality. While better late than never, this represents a tragic misunderstanding of spiritual development. It's not emergency insurance, it's the gradual cultivation of perspective that gives meaning to everything else. The men with deepest satisfaction develop these resources throughout life. not merely at its end. The psychological principle operating here is developmental maturation. Just as children develop physically and cognitively in predictable stages, spiritual understanding evolves through life experiences. Attempting to compress this development into your final years creates spiritual immaturity, wisdom, without the lived experience to embody it fully. What separates men who die with peaceful acceptance from those consumed by regret isn't religious affiliation or lack thereof. It's whether they engage the questions no balance sheet can answer. What gives my life meaning? What values will outlast me? What am I serving beyond myself? The men who confronted these questions weren't escaping reality. They were encountering it more fully than those who remained on the surface of existence. The fundamental truth is this: spiritual development isn't separate from practical living. It's the context that gives everything else coherence. Without it, retirement becomes merely an extended vacation searching for entertainment until death. With it, these years can represent the most significant period of your life, the integration of everything that came before into wisdom that transcends your individual existence. These regrets aren't merely cautionary tales, they're a map for those with eyes to see. The choice before you isn't theoretical. You stand at a crossroads that has broken better men than yourself. One path leads to an existence of hollow distraction punctuated by mounting regret, a slow surrender to meaninglessness. The other demands courage to face what you've avoided: your health, your relationships, your financial realities, your purpose, and yes, your mortality. There is no neutral ground here. Every day you postpone these reckonings, chaos gains territory in your life. Order requires conscious effort. Disorder happens by default. Ask yourself this: will you be the author of your remaining chapters, or merely their witness? The difference isn't just philosophical, it's the difference between a life completed and a life merely concluded.